Hey everyone, welcome back to Fish Den 365. I'm your host, Den Haring. If you're like me, you fish a lot of the different reservoirs in the area. Throughout the country, many dams were developed and made into different types of reservoirs, and the same is true here where I live in eastern Pennsylvania. Understanding these reservoirs is the key to catching bass because each one requires a different approach and can even determine what the species of fish are likely going to be swimming in those reservoirs. By understanding the different classifications of reservoirs, we can better be prepared to catch the bass that we're after. As anglers, we're often seeking to enhance our skills by understanding the diverse environments in which bass thrive. Reservoirs are categorized based on the terrain and geographical features of the area, which significantly influence water quality, structure, and bass behavior. The following table summarizes the four types of reservoirs that we're going to be looking at today: lowland/wetland, flatland, hillland, and highland reservoirs. Let's start by looking at a typical lowland or wetland reservoir. These reservoirs are the shallowest of the four classifications that we'll be discussing today. They are usually very shallow water. They're usually surrounded by marsh, swamp, or wetlands. They have many islands, and because they're so shallow, they tend to warm up first. So if you're living in an area that has a wetland impoundment that's close to other impoundments like hillland or highland, the bass are going to be spawning in that wetland impoundment first because the water is much more shallower and therefore will warm up much more quickly. The other thing that you should know about wetland impoundments is that they're more fertile. They are more eutrophic. The good part about that is that grows food faster and therefore grows the fish that live there faster. The negative or downside of that is that sometimes, because they're so fertile, there can be oxygen depletion and therefore fish kills on those types of reservoirs. Usually these reservoirs are characterized by very shallow water with a lot of weedy growth, lots of small islands, lots of weeds to fish. These are the ones that you're going to want to make sure you're fishing: frogs, toads, a lot of soft plastics, those kind of baits. On these reservoirs, the coves are very wide, the feeder creek is almost indistinguishable, and there are very large flats, and the main creek channel usually runs through the center. It doesn't really get close to the bank anywhere. Because the waters in these type of impoundments are usually a bit off color or at least stained, you'll want to be throwing baits that have some flash, like a spinner bait, or vibration, like a chatter bait. These are important baits to be able to throw in those types of impoundments. Also, there's usually a pretty good topwater bite on these impoundments since the water is shallow throughout. Lipless crankbaits and squarebills could also be very good in these impoundments. And the typical Texas rig, worm, lizards, Senkos all do well here. One good example of a wetland impoundment in the area where I live is Peck's Pond in Pike County. The next reservoir type that we'll look at is a flatland impoundment. A good example of a flatland impoundment would be Shohola Lake, or otherwise known as Shohola Marsh Reservoir. These impoundments are also quite shallow, but not as shallow and wide as a wetland impoundment. The creek channel rarely comes near the shore, but it can. The main lake is usually wide with extensive shallow flats, and the mouths of coves are quite wide. The points are broad, rounded, and slow tapering. These lakes are often characterized by having some standing timber, lots of logs and stumps, and usually have good weed growth as well. They are also quite fertile. Fish growth rates are usually quite good in flatland impoundments. Oftentimes, flatland impoundments can have tannic stained water as well. So again, spinner baits, lipless crankbaits, chatterbaits, all can score well here. Topwater lures again come into play as the lake is quite shallow overall. Frogs and toads again can be utilized to catch fish in pads and other emergent and submergent vegetation and around wood. Woo. Come in here, buddy. Nice toad bass there, baby. jigs as well as other soft plastic baits can do well in this environment. The next classification that we'll look at is hillland reservoirs. Two great examples of hillland reservoirs where I live are Nockamixon Lake and Blue Marsh Reservoir. Hillland reservoirs, as their name implies, were dammed in an area that had hilly terrain. Therefore, the main lake is not as wide as it would be on a lowland or flatland reservoir. The points are more pronounced than flatland, but not as sharp as a highland reservoir. The cove mouths are moderately wide, not nearly as wide as flatland and lowland. The back ends of coves are not rounded, nor are they very sharp, and the depth there is moderate. There are usually flat areas and extensive small humps throughout these impoundments. Hillland reservoirs are quite a bit deeper than lowland and flatland reservoirs. This allows the fish more options as to where to go during different times of the year. But it also allows the fishermen a lot of different ways to fish because there is a lot of different types of water in hillland reservoirs. You can find shallow options, mid-depth options, and deep options. So if you're fishing deep, you can use drop shots, spoons, blade baits. The moderate depths, crankbaits work very well, deep divers, medium divers. Hillland reservoirs usually have something for everyone when it comes to different styles of fishing. The last type of reservoir that we're going to look at today is the highland reservoir. Two examples of this would be Beltsville Dam and Lake Wallenpaupack in the area where I live. Highland reservoirs are impoundments that were dammed in higher terrain and higher areas. Therefore, the main lake is more narrow. Main lake points are short but high and sharp. Main channels often run near the shoreline. Back ends of coves are pointed and drop off quickly. Coves are usually deep but not very wide. The upstream third of the impoundment is similar to the downstream side. There are less flats on a highland impoundment. There are a few humps that mostly occur near junctions of creek channels. Highland reservoirs often support cool and cold water species like northern pike, striped bass, and trout. Deep water presentations like using spoons and blade baits can score well here, as well as drop shots, small jigs, and swim baits. Highland reservoirs are usually quite clear, and therefore topwater could work there as well because of the clear water fish can see from a longer distance. Now let's take a look at these four reservoirs and relate them back to largemouth and smallmouth bass. So on a wetland reservoir, generally you won't find smallmouth bass at all. It's usually largemouth bass. You usually have catfish and carp in those environments as well. But the smallmouth does not do well in that environment. And the same is true for the flatland impoundments. There might be a few smallmouths, but there won't be very many at all, much less than the largemouths. The hillland impoundments are also dominated by largemouths, but there are a good population of smallmouths in these usually as well. And the key to this is that some of the biggest smallmouth bass grow in hillland impoundments. Dale Hollow Reservoir is a great example of this in Tennessee. And so remember, if you're looking for a monster smallmouth, some of the hillland reservoirs here in Pennsylvania contain them as well. Nockamixon, for example, doesn't have very many as far as percentage-wise, maybe 10%, but there's some giants in there. Now, when we look at hillland reservoirs, largemouths typically dominate there. Could be 70-30, 90-10, just depends on the reservoir. When we get to highland reservoirs, that's where the smallmouth dominates. So if you're looking to catch more smallmouth bass and you want to go after them, look for highland reservoirs because they're more likely going to be the dominant species there. Largemouths will live there too, and interestingly, they grow very big largemouths, but the dominant species in most highland reservoirs are smallmouth bass. So in knowing this, you can kind of determine, looking at the shape of a lake, you can determine these things by looking at a map to see what the shape of the lake is, and then determine whether or not you're in a highland, lowland, flatland, hillland environment. Now there's other types. There are in other parts of the country, there's canyon reservoirs, for example. There's plateau reservoirs. But there's not as many of those in the area where I live, and so we focused on in this video on these four. But knowing something about this, you can kind of know what bass are likely to be in there without knowing anything else about the lake. So it'll help you determine where to go based on what you want to catch. Well, I hope you found this summary and classifications of these different reservoirs helpful and interesting. This information came from fishermen back in the mid-70s. This is Al and Rod Linder, two pioneers in fishing, that came up with these classifications, and they're extremely helpful still today. This is great information. I hope you enjoyed it. I hope you got something out of it. If you did, give me a thumbs up, subscribe to the channel, keep it tuned here. We'll have some more interesting content very shortly. And if you want to see a video on some of the top walk dog topwater baits, take a look at this one right here. Until next time, be safe out there, and as always, may God bless your fishing endeavors.